Hi, I'm Ed Jaffe and welcome to JaffeWoodwinds.com. Today we're at the home of one of the most beloved and venerated studio musicians New York has ever had. A saxophone clarinetist and flutist who personified exactly what a great studio musician, a great musician is, and through his many years of playing, set a standard that few have ever reached before. Dave Tofani has recorded over 600 albums, over 100 movie soundtracks, been voted 3 times, I believe, the Naris Award for Most Valuable Player, and the only woodwind player to ever be nominated for that award on 5 different instruments: soprano sax, alto sax, tenor sax, flute, and clarinet. That's just a little bit of what Dave accomplished in his career. He's also a wonderful composer and arranger, and has had a number of solo albums out now that have been Grammy nominated, and has been a real force for all woodwind players in New York for many decades now. And so it's really a great honor to be spending this afternoon with Dave. And Dave, thanks for having me out at your place and agreeing to do this.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, it's true, and I've known you now for quite a few years, and
yes,
always looked up to you as someone who personified the integrity of the great studio musicians, of those who came up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s in New York, and really set a high standard for us. And so I want to go through that today and talk about your career, your history, and hopefully provide some information for those who may be of a younger generation, who may be not as conversant with what went on during the glory years of studio recording in New York. So let's go back to your beginnings. You grew up in Williamsport, Pennsylvania.
That's right.
And you began on clarinet, I believe, at a rather young age. So can you take us through those early years and how you got into playing woodwinds and how you got into playing various styles of music?
I began on clarinet, and fortunately for me, my mother's brother was a really beautiful alto saxophone and clarinet player. And my dad always trusted him very much as a family member, not only with the music, but with personal matters. And he was just that kind of a wonderful person and generous-hearted. And he went to, my uncle's name was Americo, a.k.a. Uncle Mert. So my dad asked him, his nickname was Mert, of course. He would say, "Mert, can you start Davy on the clarinet?" And this was, I think I was 8 or 9 years old in that area. And Uncle Mert said, "Well, I certainly can start him, but I don't want to become his teacher." He said, "Because I have my background, I've studied with I don't have a consistent background where I studied with people that had the classical training to really go through the studies and all that." So he said, let's find a bona fide teacher for Dave. So right off the bat, he was looking out for me, and being a family member.
Right.
So he and my dad, probably mostly him, searched out a teacher, and they found Doris Brown in Williamsport, PA, who had studied at the Eastman School of Music with William Ossick.
Oh, yeah.
And she used to drive from Williamsport, PA, all the way to Rochester, New York, to study. She wasn't enrolled in the college, but she worked very hard to go up there for lessons. And she was going through all the conservatory curriculum. So that's the way she taught. So unbeknownst to me at the time, she started on the very basic stuff and went through everything, and then progressively getting more of the studies. And I didn't realize it then, but she was taking me through the conservatory sort of training. So,
and this was on clarinet only?
This was on clarinet only. Okay. Yeah. So I never touched the saxophone for 4 years after starting with her.
Right.
But so when we were about to go get in an instrument and start studying, I said, Uncle Mert, I want to play the saxophone. You know, that's what a kid does, you know. I want to play the saxophone.
Sure.
And lucky for me, he took the time, not to say it wasn't enough for him to teach me or to start me, but he actually kind of sat with me and talked and very kindly told me why I should start on clarinet. He said, the clarinet, you cover the holes with your fingers, and that you develop these smart fingers that have to cover the holes. And whereas the saxophone, you're putting down a key, and
Right.
You don't have to cover any hole. You're just closing a key. And he said, and when it comes time for you to play the saxophone, you'll have a more difficult transition. So I accepted that, and I started on clarinet.
You mean you'll have a less difficult transition to saxophone?
You have a less difficult transition.
Right.
Yes. Not that you can't transition, because many people have. But I think it was a good way to go. Closing those holes it was a good setup for woodwind doubling. You know, but those you don't think about those things when you're a kid.
Of course not.
But so I studied with Doris for about I think 8 or 9 years.
Wow.
And and when it came to time to let's see, no, it was 7 years. About 7 years. That's still 6, 7 years. It was still a good.
Yeah, that's a
I
long
still
time.
have the books I went through with her.
Yeah.
And with all the
the
dates.
And you know what?
There.
I still have my first books from my first teachers too. It's really
it's wonderful to see that.
It is. It's a nice thing to hold on to and recapture those moments.
It was baseball. This sounds funny. Baseball that improved my sight reading.
Well, you grew up in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is the home of the Little League World Series.
You have to play baseball if you're in Williamsport, PA. So I was starting to play baseball, and I was told I had to practice 30 minutes, and so I had a little West clock. It was 6 o'clock. When that big hand hit the half hour,
boom, right.
I was out. I grabbed my baseball glove, run up to the field, and then I was doing well with Doris in my studies. I was kind of flying through these studies, but then the music started getting more difficult, and so in 30 minutes I was not able to accomplish these difficult figures and rhythms.
Right.
So Doris started bearing down on me a little bit. She said, David, you're going to have to spend more time in practicing, and she would put parentheses around the difficult passages. And she taught me to focus on these passages, because you're playing everything else okay. Just focus and repeat this slowly, and then pick up the tempo. Right. And then you can go to the top of the study and play it all the way through. And sure enough, that worked, you know?
Right.
So I attribute that kind of thing, and I still was getting it into the 30 minutes. For a while, I attribute that to becoming a good sight reader, which is a major thing in most things, but especially studio.
Especially in the studio work you did. Now, the saxophone, you said you picked up about 3-4 years after you began clarinet. Was she teaching you saxophone as well, or did you have a different teacher for that?
No, she did not teach me saxophone. She didn't play saxophone. She was definitely into the music, but I really learned from my uncle and just on my own. And being that the keyboard in that certain octave is the same,
right?
I flowed right into it, and then of course I had my uncle to guide me somewhat.
And was he a good sounding player?
He had a beautiful sound on alto, and he sounded excellent on clarinet as well.
So that was what you grew up hearing and was in your ear.
Yeah, right off the bat. Even at 9 or 10 years old, I sensed some kind of quality about it. And my parents always enjoyed his playing, and also just enjoyed him as a person too.
Right. And
so,
I imagine you also played in school bands and orchestras and things like that.
yes. I played in all the school bands and later in a civic orchestra in Williamsport.
Right. Now, we
But
talked a little bit ago about the fact that at 16 you went to a Stan Kenton a band camp during the summer. So
yes,
to get into that camp and to play in that, you must have been, and you were doing this on saxophone, obviously, as primarily a saxophonist, right?
yes.
So you must have, even though you didn't have the formal instruction on saxophone, you must have been, pretty accomplished to get into those bands of Stan Kenton in those days. So
Yeah, I was surprised that the college age kids that were there, even older. I mean, some guys in their late 20s, early 30s, and I won the chair for lead alto. I mean, I was really kind of surprised, but it was all about coming in a room and playing for these guys from Stan Kenton's band and sight reading. They'd put charts up on the stand and play this, and they were just total gentlemen. That whole era was just a kinder and gentler time.
And can you give us a date on that, just so people can?
That was probably 1962.
Okay.
I believe.
Okay.
And the thing was, just previous to that, Uncle Mert got me into Johnny Nicolosi's orchestra. I have a picture of that.
Was this a local orchestra?
It was a local big band, and it was I would call it a near professional band, semi-professional band. And to make a long story, in my memoir, I tell this whole story of how Uncle Mert used to play lead alto with Johnny Nicolosi. And they played every Friday and Saturday night in the Lycoming Hotel. And it was a really excellent sounding band, good trumpet players, but players came from all around Pennsylvania.
And you would have been the youngest, I imagine.
I was the youngest one. It seems like it was my good fortune that they needed somebody. And my uncle said, they need a tenor saxophone player. I didn't even own a tenor then.
Alto was your first instrument.
Alto was my first saxophone. Okay. So I was, I got the phone call. He said, Johnny's going to call you. And
right.
So I was already starting the practice of accepting or denying a job, Right. So I said, sure, I'd love to do it. So I hung up the phone and realized I don't have a tenor. But so Uncle Mert again, and my father's dear friend, Sammy Ray, who played tenor and played quite well. He had his own bands, Sammy Ray and the Soft Sounds. So I had these two guys who were, kind of rooting for me and just supportive, so supportive. So they put the word out, right, looking for a used tenor. So I can't remember how it transpired, but they found a King Super 20 old. It was with a silver bell. Remember the old King?
Oh my gosh.
The bell was no longer silver, but it was totally tarnished.
That's funny.
But they had a repairman look after it and put it into shape, and I got it. And my uncle set me up with a mouthpiece, and off I went.
There you go.
And I liked it right away. I took to it.
With all these positive influences around you, it's no wonder that you kept gravitating to expanding your horizons in music. With an uncle and friends of his, and people who had these local bands, and you're the youngest, and you're being accepted. I can imagine that it just gave you so much confidence and so much joy, as a young person. Young people at any age, at any time, 16, 17 years old is a difficult time for young people, but to be accepted in these bands and by older folks, it must have done so much for you personally.
Absolutely. And in those days, and I imagine even in this era, I would hope that if a young player comes into a band the next youngest guy must have been 35, 40, 50. There were guys in that band. Gene Hoover, who played with the big bands, he played tenor. He was on the solo tenor chair. I was on the second tenor chair. And I name him as one of my influences. They were just so very supportive. The very first day I went there to rehearse, I remember, warming up on my tenor sort of quietly, reluctantly, and the drummer said, "Geez, he sounds like Stan Getz," and I have to crack up at that because my uncle used to play Stan Getz records, Dave Brubeck with Paul Desmond records, Count Basie, hear Lester Young solos, and of course some Charlie Parker stuff. And Stan Kenton he was the big band guy.
Right.
Of the white bands. Stan Kenton was it.
You're establishing yourself in your local area and you're studying clarinet. You've gotten hooked on saxophone. You're playing in some local bands. How is it that you get to the Juilliard School as an undergraduate studying clarinet with Joe Allard?
What got me going on Juilliard was Gary Steele, great trombone player in Williamsport. He took a teaching job, and he was in New York for a while, but he had a bunch of kids and he wanted to teach, so that's what he did. And Faith and Hope Lawson, both pianists who graduated from Juilliard, and they used to sing the praises of Juilliard.
So these were your local musicians who got it in your head about Juilliard.
Yes, they did. They first introduced me to it, and then I started learning more about it. And I studied with Faith Lawson, studied piano. So I was really getting some direct input about the school and all that. So, so I in applying for the job, we were so out green, I should say, in the application I put down, I checked the box for honorary scholarship. And I mean, that says something about our family. My sister says the same thing. My dad was a railroad worker, but I thought we didn't need the money. Now, how naive is that? That's when I checked the box. And my parents didn't correct me because they weren't really in on it that much,
Right.
But so then later, of course, I didn't do that the second year, but and I was able to get some funds, but so I did not put down a teacher. I'm telling the absolute bare truth here, which is painful for me to say even now. I knew about Joe Allard, and I think Gary Steele said, "I'm not sure you can be a clarinet major and study with Joe." He may have put that doubt in my mind.
Right.
Unfortunately. So I had heard about Joe. So I didn't, they assigned me to Arthur Chrisman. Did you know who?
I know of him. I never met the man.
Okay,
but I certainly know of him.
He was a bona fide teacher, a very technically oriented teacher with Berman scale studies, Krebs studies, of course, some solo literature. And his grade, you were based on how much did you practice this week? And that's how he based your grade. So I thought, even at 18 or 17, I thought that was kind of silly that couldn't I say I practiced 40 hours, But of course, you have to put down realistic things. But so I got a dose of technical workout. So I have to say, okay, it was a benefit. But anytime I asked him, well, Mr. Chrisman, how do I get a full sound up in the high register on the clarinet? I think I've heard people get a really nice full sound up there. He said, well, practice more, find things to practice up there more, spends.
Yeah.
Okay. I tried that, but it didn't work,
Yeah.
So, but then I started hearing more and more about Joe.
From his students.
Other students.
Yeah, right.
And then understanding that, I think I asked the dean, I said, can I study with Joe Allard, even though he said, oh, of course. He said, Joe, Mr. Allard is teaching lots of clarinet players. Oh, okay. So then one day in the cafeteria, I don't know if the new Juilliard was like that, but I went into the cafeteria and saw Joe. Of course, by that
Yes,
time,
he would eat lunch in the cafeteria with the students.
yeah, with the students. And
Right.
I looked around and all these kids gravitating around this guy with the white hair. I said,
yeah.
"That's Joe Allard." So I went over and sat down, and we started this conversation. Once I got to speak to Joe, and we really connected musically and things about the embouchure, tone, the rare things that get talked about, beauty, and what's the other thing?
Resonance.
Intensity.
And
Intensity of tone.
Yes.
And I loved the conversation. It made so much sense. And
yes. And he had that way about him, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself.
Oh, yeah.
And the way he talked about these fundamentals, he talked about them with such, there was reverence almost about them, that there was something beyond just the, normal conversation. It was something elegant, something beyond the norm.
Oh, it's so true.
And
It's so true.
And just the way he approached the subjects when he would teach, I always felt it made you feel like you were in some kind of a special scenario because of the way he presented it.
Definitely. That's a very good way of putting his approach.
Yes.
And in one of your, I think that Joe gave us all who studied with him a mechanism, an apparatus that could be used on each single reed instrument that you play.
And pertaining to any style of music that you would play.
Right, exactly. Right. He didn't concern himself with, are you going to play jazz or classical music? No, it's about getting a tone that will work in any kind of music, and then it's up to you as a musician to interpret the music that you're playing.
During these years of study, Joe, as an undergrad at Juilliard, he did something to sort of kickstart your career that I think is one of the most wonderful stories I've ever heard of a teacher helping a student enter the professional ranks. Can you talk about how you ended up playing on the Bell Telephone Hour?
Oh, sure.
Because I think it's just a perfect example of when a teacher recognizes they have a student, a talented student, who's going to be a professional, and there's an opportunity they see that they can help them make that foray into the professional world. Joe did that for you.
Oh, he did. He's such a generous-hearted person. It was also a little bit of being at the right place at the right time and being prepared. However, I looked forward to my lessons with Joe weekly, as I'm sure you did.
They were the highlight of the week.
The highlight of the week. It was a joy to go there, no matter what difficulties you may or may not have. It just was your learning. You were somebody who really invested himself in the beauty of playing this instrument. So,
and let me just interrupt for a second, just to give those who don't know about Joe Allard as much. This was a gentleman who, at one time, taught as many as 60 to 70 students a week, because in the 70s, by the time I had studied with him, he was not only teaching at Juilliard and the Manhattan School of Music, he was also traveling to Boston and teaching at the New England Conservatory. He then also acquired the Mannes School of Music and would teach at home on Sundays and Tuesdays. He literally taught 7 days a week after his playing days were over in the mid-60s. And he never seemed to get sick. He never seemed tired. It was an amazing feat. I mean, I get tired sometimes just teaching one student 2 or 3 hours. Like, oh man, I have nothing left. And he was like a dynamo.
He would gain energy from showing people, teaching these techniques. Anyway, I got with Joe, and it was a transformation for me. Just every week, I just loved it. It's like nobody, all these years, well, I was only, 18 by then, or something like that. nobody ever discussed these things of pressure on the reed, how much reed do you put in your mouth, how much reed are you covering, you know. When you begin to play, you want to be in centric position, certainly not protruded, you know. And, you know, just such wonderful techniques,
Sure.
solidly based things.
Based on scientific principles.
Yeah, really. So anyway, I was working hard on this every day. So I came into this lesson. It might have been my second year with Joe. I have to figure out these dates. So I probably was 19, going on 20. I had the usual wonderful lesson, was walking out, left the studio and walking down the hallway to get the elevator and closed the door. And then 3 seconds later, the door pops open. It was Joe. He said, "Oh, Dave, by the way, you're going to get a call for the Bell telephone hour next week. So and there's a tenor solo. It's tenor and clarinet. Get a good read." And then he slammed the door. I said, "What?" And then the next student went in the studio.
Right.
I felt like going back there, knocking on the door, you know, like, "What did you say?"
Now let's set up what Joe was the first clarinet player on the Bell Telephone
Yes.
Hour, and also played saxophone at times
Yes.
on it. And the Bell Telephone Hour was a weekly broadcast live
Yes.
all across
live.
the country, and
Yeah.
highlighting some of the great artists, classical artists, pop artists. I mean,
Yes.
it was a high level
Oh, yeah.
gig, with incredible musicians throughout the whole orchestra.
And they had the artists, guest artists were like the most gifted artists of the day. Brigitte Nielsen, Heifetz played, and pop artists, a few jazz artists, and I you know, when he said that to me, my mind was flooded with what? I went home and practiced for 3 hours, you know, and worked on my tenor reeds, clarinet reeds, you know, and so there was a solo. There was a solo for Polly Bergen. It was an open spot for a tenor solo, and I was thinking, wow, Joe must have great confidence in me to recommend me. So as I knew nothing, that's all I knew. That's all I knew was that I was going to get a call, and I got a call, and I was young and nervous and thinking. So the guy, Bill Trone, trombone player, was a contractor, and he said, "Do you have a union card?" And I said, "Yeah." I didn't. I mean, so I just scrambled to go get a union card.
Right.
But then Joe told me what to do. Hi Jaffe, remember him?
Yes, I got into the union with Hi Jaffe too. I mean,
Yeah.
not related, but
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's some in-house thing.
No. But he was the guy down at Local 802,
Yeah.
and would get you in, and you know, oftentimes it was just like I used a gentleman named Mike Fiore, who was a fixed brass instruments. He made the call to Hi Jaffe, let Ed Jaffe in the unit in. So
Yeah.
Joe probably did the same thing.
Something like that.
Yeah,
you know, I
yeah,
went and saw
yeah.
Hi Jaffe, got the card right off. You know, they asked you a little questionnaire.
Yeah.
Are you joining the union for a specific job? He said, put down no.
No. yeah. That's
Don't want any of the old guys questioning why is this kid getting that job.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, that's great.
So,
but let's cut to the chase here now. Obviously, it went well, and you eventually played with the Bell Telephone Orchestra for a number of seasons.
You know, as luck would have it, Charlie Russo was playing second clarinet. He got the job. He got the job at the New York City Opera.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, just about at that time. So once I played the show once, I started almost taking over the job in the next few weeks.
And for those who don't, Charlie Russo was a wonderful clarinet player who ended up playing principal at the New York City Opera for years, and also people may not know this, played very good saxophone.
Yeah, he did. Yes.
Good tenor, and he
Yes.
played swing clarinet. I heard he played me some takes of him playing in the Benny Goodman style. I couldn't believe it. It was absolutely beautiful.
Very talented guy.
Very.
Yeah.
And so that's an important name for those younger players watching. Tremendous play. So you were a natural fit there. Going right in.
You know, as you know, the orchestra was like a symphony orchestra, and then when there was swing band stuff or any jazz-oriented music, the brass players would change to more big band style with 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, and the reed section usually had Joe Soldo played lead alto.
Yes.
And Joe Allard played second alto. And I was playing, the first tenor chair, and then the bassoon player had a 4th tenor chair.
Yeah.
And then a baritone player. No, yeah, one of the bassoon players was a baritone player.
Yeah, in those days, it was not uncommon for so-called legit single reed players to also play some saxophone.
Yeah.
But that must have been an amazing experience.
It was a gas.
For a young fellow. You're still an undergrad and you're playing with the who's who of the New York.
And Julie Baker was on first flute.
Not
so
bad.
Listening to him didn't hurt any. But the thing was, the solo came that day at the rehearsal. We had one rehearsal and then they do the show.
Let me just repeat that.
Oh, yeah.
You're playing, because today's music industry, you get the music through, on your computer, you practice it, and you rehearse, and you rehearse, and you rehearse.
Yeah.
In those days, one rehearsal and right to live TV.
Yeah.
Only and one take on national TV, because it's going all over the country.
Yes, I think it was Friday night rehearsal, something like that, and then Sunday, I believe, was the show. And the solo came up, and I was a little bit nervous, although confident. But it came up, and I just what do? You pour yourself into it, and played something musical. And Voorhees at the rehearsal went like this to Joe. He looked at Joe, not me. He went. He went like this.
We're talking about Donald Voorhees, who was the conductor. And apparently, from what I'm told, I remember Joe telling me he was a very demanding...
He was pretty demanding.
Yeah.
he was a pianist, and he was pretty fussy. But he looked at Joe after my solo, and he went like this. And I thought, why didn't he do that for me? But he was telling Joe that was a good recommendation, I guess.
Yeah.
So it went well, thank God. And so... it was, I got the job in the next couple of weeks.
And I just want to, again, interject the point that for those out there who have students and who are teachers, if you have talented students and you have the ability to help students get into the industry, or give them at least an opportunity to see what it's about, I think it's really an important job of a teacher to make that transition for the student that much easier, at least to give them at least a shot. And Joe certainly did that for you, and that's why I wanted to really bring that out, because I think it's a wonderful example, and certainly it gave a springboard to your career, meeting so many great players.
Yeah, sure.
And now, while you're at Juilliard, and you're obviously studying clarinet with Joe, but maybe some saxophone too in the lessons.
Oh,
perhaps?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I really. Joe was so cool, because I said, Joe, I really want to study quite a bit of saxophone if I could. And he said, oh, absolutely. He said, we'll just keep it among ourselves.
Right. That's right.
That's Joe.
Yes.
We don't want to get involved in the administration, giving you credits.
And I had it coming the other way, because I was in as a saxophone major for my master's, and I'd study clarinet and bass clarinet with him. I mean, how lucky.
Oh,
I mean,
a phenomenal teacher.
I often say this to people, and you can appreciate it more than perhaps anyone, that if I hadn't met Joe Allard, I don't know if I would have had a career in the music industry. I really don't. He was that
influential.
He was God.
Yeah.
For me. Yeah. I mean, for me.
Well, I have to say, I feel somewhat that way, because of we have to talk about this doubling thing, because I think Joe, with the apparatus or the embouchure
Right.
that he was so informed about, made it possible to play alto, tenor, soprano, clarinet, and not have to stand on your head and change everything to get to another instrument.
Right. So, Dave, you just talked about some of the things that Joe would emphasize, the fundamentals that made it easier to transition from any single reed instrument to another. But let's talk a little bit more in detail about what you felt were his most significant contributions to woodwind playing, and to those of us who were fortunate enough to study with him for any length of time.
Sure. It's amazing how many things there are, how many points there could be. If you think about it, those things that are specific techniques that can be shown, that can be taught, Joe somehow thought about those things, and he read often about the principles of he talked a lot about principles, right? The books on the principles.
Totally. And we also, it should be noted, Joe graduated high school, went to one semester of New England Conservatory, and then was on the road. He never graduated college, but was one of the most educated people with regard to the ergonomics related to playing and principles of playing music that I've ever met.
Oh, yes. Right.
And so I think he took a special interest in reading and learning from stuff, because it wasn't given to him at the college, because he was already, at 18 years old, he was on the road with some local bands.
Yeah.
So,
you said ergonomics. Ergonomics is so important, and it's what gives you longevity. But specifically, some of the things that I learned from him is, one of the things that comes to mind is that when you pick up your instrument and you approach your playing, you approach the reed, is to be in centric position. Well, what is centric? It just means center. I've asked dentists about that. All it means is center, and not protruding the jaw. And of course, it's almost impossible to retrude the jaw, back the other way.
Right.
Right.
But centric is different for every person.
Yes.
In other words, basically, as I understood it, as well as just to use your natural occlusion, your natural bite.
Yes. Where your jaw falls when it closes, occlusion. Yes. It's amazing, though, I see so many students who, when they begin, reach for the reed. It might be a sort of an intuitive thing to do, but it creates a tension on the reed. But the other thing is, one of the most dramatic things, I think, is that I never heard from anyone. I never heard any teacher or player describe it except Joe. Now there are people maybe describing it because Joe's students.
Yes.
The jaw pushes the teeth through the lip to feel the reed.
Right.
Let me think about that for a second. Yeah, the jaw pushes the teeth through the lip to feel the reed. So, that explanation is so wonderful. Once you think about it and put it in practice.
Right. However, I have that thing, sometimes in order to feel the reed, I've had students who really, in essence, bite in order to feel. So I have only, for myself, I've substituted one word. I have used the word sense the reed instead of feel the reed. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
But and Joe made that clear when he was teaching it to us. But sometimes if you're use that word to others, I have to feel it, so I got to really
too much pressure on the reed.
But
but
it's so true. That's such a unique part of his.
It's an explanation that only someone who's thought about this very deeply could come up with.
Yes.
And some of the wonderful clarinetists may very well do the very same thing, and I'm sure they do, the best ones.
Sure.
But they cannot explain it. So, and the other thing is pressure and release. That's what you're talking about. Pressure on the reed, but there's also a release of the reed. How do you know about this? Let the ear be the guide. That's the thing. You have to listen to yourself very carefully. and Joe taught me that too, is he had an ear that, especially the colorations of a tone, right? The colors of the rainbow, somehow if he heard it was a little too many highs, too many lows, he just had such a wonderful sense of sound. And he could explain it. And that's invaluable. And another thing is Joe sat next to Daniel Bonad for a number of years, apparently. Well, on and off, they did orchestral jobs.
And he studied with Bonad a little bit.
Yes, sir, he studied with Bonad.
And they also shared a teaching studio for a number of years together.
Was it not Radio City?
No,
that's where Joe.
Not above Wayland's.
Yeah.
There was another studio, and it wasn't the Carnegie Recital Hall studio, but they had shared for a brief period of time. They shared a studio. Joe was very close to Bonad.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they both spoke French. And
yeah.
Joe spoke perfect French.
Yes.
And the fact that he could solfege a piece of music at sight.
Incredible.
Wonderful. I mean, the guy had a wonderful ear. If he had, if he looked at a piece, even sometimes a very chromatic-oriented kind of modern piece, he could sing the damn thing after, if he'd go through it once. And it was quite remarkable.
Yes.
I'm sure most of the other classical clarinet players could not do that.
Yeah. His solfege was outstanding, and also he had an incredible tessitura in singing.
Yeah.
He could sing.
Yeah, the falsetto.
So it was ridiculous.
Singers work for years on that falsetto.
Yeah, he had it.
Yeah. And the thing that, one of the things he learned from Bonad, which I'm sure passed on to anybody who wanted to know, is learning to get the line of the lip to the line of the teeth. Because he asked Bonad, how do you play so loud sometimes and it's so strong? Puts more lip inside the mouth with the line of the lip to the line of the teeth, and you put some air into the instrument and it's full,
Yes. And that sounds so simplistic when you say it, but most people, when you think of covering the teeth, they just think about the part that's most in direct contact with the reed in the middle of your mouth. They don't think about what's happening with the lip and the corners. And that, for me, that was something I had to work so hard on for so many years, because I had no knowledge of this. And I was the complete opposite. I had to completely relearn. And I'm glad I encountered Joe Allard as a teenager. I think I was 18, but man, I had no knowledge that you could keep your lip over your teeth in the corners.
Yeah.
That it was even important, because the reed's not there.
Right.
But boy, what a difference.
It really does.
Oh.
It keeps the lip from compressing on the side of the reed.
So you get the entire vibration of the sides of the reed.
Yeah. And it's just amazing. The upper lip was one of the amazing, incredible things too, is the first time Joe introduced me to it, the upper lip closes the mouth. What? So when you create this, the lower lip, left and right, being close to the teeth, no, you can, if you're holding firmly, the air can escape, but learning to let the upper lip actually close the opening. When he said that to me, the upper lip closes the mouth. Yeah, okay. I was doing it a little bit, which was starting to happen, but then he showed me the technique of practicing it.
Yes.
And it's kind of weird, like lifting your upper lip and
still playing.
Yeah. So, but these concepts are so good, and they work. That's the thing. It works.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like if you think of an athlete. And I like to use golf because because it's stationary, you're dealing with a ball that's not moving, you have to set it in motion. But also you can see golfers playing from 10 years old. You can see them playing at 80 and 90 years old. You can play it like an instrument for your whole life if your fundamentals are good.
Yes.
And Joe had thought about all of these various aspects because he had an inquisitive mind.
Yes.
And unlike some teachers, would not hold back on something. Well, I'll teach them all of that stuff, but I won't teach them this one little
Not
thing
the
which
real
sets me
secrets.
apart. Right. No,
Well,
he was totally giving.
I understand Duquesne said to Joe more than once, "You're crazy to teach all your students the secrets.
Really?
They're going to take your job." It was somebody at the Juilliard faculty. May have been Duquesne. He was a nice man, but he, more than one person said that to Joe. Why are you showing all these secrets to these young people?
This brings to mind, if I'm just going to interject, this wonderful story Joe Soldo told me. I think he even said this on the interview I did with Joe. But for a number of years, Joe Allard played, whenever they played pictures at an exhibition at the Philharmonic, Joe would do it. One year he couldn't do it, and he recommended Joe Soldo. And Joe did it, and it apparently went over very well. And the next season, they called Joe Soldo to do it. And Joe Soldo told me he was very reluctant. And he went to Joe Allen and he said, "Joe, I don't know what to do. This is not right. You were the one who was doing it." And Joe had a smile on his face. He just said, "Are you kidding? You don't know how wonderful that makes me feel that my student, they thought so much of you to want to call you back and do it." He said, "You do it." And it was one of the great stories, Joe.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It's
that's
a great,
wonderful.
But that's what Joe is about.
Oh, sure. He was such a big-hearted person, a giver. But also, it reminds me that his wife, Ann, said Joe didn't like to go out and play in the evenings. In the evening, I said, "Oh, okay, that eliminates concerts, shows." He loved teaching.
Yes,
he loved teaching.
He did, and when he retired from playing, because of and he retired at a young age, I think he was about 55, because of periodontal problems.
Yes, the teeth. Yeah, he expressed that to me later after I played with him on the Bell Telephone Hour. He said, "You see, there's stuff sometimes that," he said, "if I get something really difficult to play, Dave," he said, "I may just pass the part to you." And I'm like, "Really?" He said, "No, because I can't put the pressure on my teeth that I used to with the false teeth, because
he had no feeling."
So that never happened. But
but I mean, the point was his transition from full-time player and teacher to full-time teacher was natural for him.
Oh yeah, he enjoyed it. But the one thing I forgot to mention, it just flew out of my mind again. Oh, I heard Joe play Rhapsody in Blue at least 2 or 3 times, in that particular weekend when they were doing that. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful. He had a sound that was kind of a cross between German kind of clarinet and French. It had a lightness, but yet a fullness. And of course, the musical part was just beautiful. And it didn't get corny the way so many of the classical guys do, where they bend the notes too much.
Yeah.
You must feel the same thing when you hear it, like
over inflected.
Yeah. So, but it was beautifully done.
Let me just change a little bit of the subject. While you're still at Juilliard, you were also beginning to study jazz with teachers who weren't even at Juilliard. You were studying with Lenny Tristano.
Yeah.
And were you also studying flute on the side at that time?
I actually started studying the flute in high school with the guy that was retired from the Detroit Symphony, first flute, Myron Mayer. I still have a book that he gave me. And I used to go with 2 other would-be college students, flute players, and the drive to took a drive to Denville, Pennsylvania, and three of us would go there for a lesson. We'd each get a private lesson.
Oh.
And then we'd play trios or quartets, however many kids came with us. And I was hanging on for dear life. I just I practiced the flute a little bit at home, but I just threw myself into this mix, and it was good for me though, because it was a challenge,
Sure, but what a great thing. But the point was, here you are at Juilliard as a classical clarinet major, yet you're studying saxophone. You had begun flute studies. I know you studied with Harold Bennett.
Harold Bennett.
And then Tom Neifinger.
And then Tom Neifinger.
Right.
Yeah.
Who were not affiliated as your teachers at Juilliard.
Yes.
You took it upon yourself to do that.
Yes, that's right.
As you did jazz with Lenny Tristano during that time.
And the first one in New York was my very first year at Juilliard, when I was still studying with Arthur Chrisman. I went and studied with Kenny Dorham for a little while.
Oh, would you tell that story? You told me that story. It knocked me off my seat. I had no idea of this. So
I was at Manny's buying reeds. It was my first year at Juilliard, and I purchased a reed from this young man, black guy behind the counter, and we did the purchase. And I was walking out, and I saw Henry at the door. Henry, I forgot his last name, Henry Manny, I call him. But I said, Henry, that looks like Kenny Dorham. Is that Kenny Dorham, the jazz trumpet player? He said, he sure is. I said, wow. I said, he's working here? He said, yeah. He said, when it's slow, we're happy to have him here. And he teaches upstairs. And my ears perked up. I said, he teaches upstairs? Yeah. I went back to the counter, spoke to him. And I said, Kenny, could we get together? Like, yes, next week. So we made a date, and I met him upstairs, and it was wonderful. I mean, he was a pretty good teacher. We had some tunes that we put up there on the stand, but he had some stuff he wrote, with some chord changes. And I said, there's a question I have to ask you. I had played in a big band back in Pennsylvania, and I played solos and stuff. I said, but what when you're playing a song, do you know the changes at all times? Like, in fact, I said, Kenny, if you're playing a chorus and I stop you, could you tell me what chord you're on? I mean, that was this, an 18-year-old kid's question.
Asking the master.
Do you know what chord you're on? He said, no, I'm just hearing that shit. That's what he said. I said, okay, I'm relieved. I forgot to mention John Laporta, who was at the Stan Kenton clinics, and of course it didn't last that long, but he had some really cool ideas of the common tone in the blues, is learning and playing rhythms off the common tone, which is the most simple and basic way to play the blues. But it was such a great little technique, I would teach all my students that, and of course I used it a lot, and you go off from there to do it. Right. And then he had a headband where we'd make stuff up on the spot, and it was so, wow. I never thought I'd have to do that in a recording session, but it happened.
Guess what?
It happened.
Hey, as long as we mentioned that, let's talk about the environment of the studios in the 60s and 70s when you entered it. If to those who were younger and even those who went through it just to hear it again, can you describe what it was like as a studio player in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s? What was the day like, the week like? How did you manage your life and juggling between all these instruments and knowing you had, so many dates each week and you didn't know what music you were going to encounter? How did you balance all those things? What was your routine like?
Yeah, it's work. You have to work at it. You have to stay with it. But I guess I would say I had a general routine where if I knew I'm in this, I'm going to be doubling. So I would have a routine where I did saxophone, clarinet, flute, or usually in the other order, flute, clarinet, saxophone. And then once I really got more serious about the flute and studying with Tom Neifinger, and Harold Bennett too, is and if I was going to be called upon to play flute on sessions, because I didn't have that history from 9 years old, that's one of the reasons I studied with Harold Bennett. I wanted to go through some of that literature and put myself through all the technical studies. Kneifinger was certainly a more interesting teacher, and very much like Joe
Allard, yeah.
Get you to the point of what are you doing at the embouchure hole,
Right. Yeah.
What's going on there, and how can you improve your playing without having to play 12 etudes,
Right.
play 8 measures and make a change. So the flute sort of at one period, as you might guess, dominated my practicing.
It has to.
Yeah, it has to, because because on the reed instruments, of course, they have a certain compatibility, a certain relation, whereas the flute the lip is on the outside of your mouth, and you have to create this aperture. So you really had to stay with it. One time, and I was doing this routine. So Ray Beckenstein in the New York Saxophone Quartet and asked me, we were playing some of these woodwind doubling pieces.
Oh, I know the one Bernie Hoffer wrote.
Bernie Hoffer
yes,
wrote.
I know that.
And then there was some other stuff going
yeah.
on. And Ray said to me, we'd warm up the rehearsal. Ray said to me, Dave, how do you keep such good flute chops? Yeah, well, thank you very much. I said, well, I'll tell you the truth. When I don't have time to practice, I do the, what's the name of the tone studies?
Moïse tone.
Moïse.
Yeah.
The Moïse, which is the pyrotechnical studies for lips, for chops.
The book is De la Sonorité.
De la Sonorité.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I would do that for 10 to 15 minutes. That's it. I mean, I certainly wanted to practice more, but when time is a constraint, I'd take one. It's like a Chinese food menu. Take one from each group, and play it. Especially those things with the crescendo, diminuendo,
and then the ones with the opening up of the intervals from the middle of the flute. Then you get
low to high, and going to the extreme high to the extreme low.
Yeah.
And I found those so beneficial too. So he said, "Really, I'll have to try that." It's not a substitute for going through other pieces, but if you're a woodwind doubler, you only you have to think about your time. So that was one of the things I did do. But I used to. Now the question was, how do you manage all this?
Right.
It does take a certain amount of discipline, that's for sure, or keeping it in mind. But I used to target certain things. For example, if I played the Dave Matthews Band, and I played soprano, alto, and flute. So if I knew Monday night is coming, so I used to stay with my routine: flute, clarinet, flute, and then soprano, saxophone, and alto. And I'd try to at least be on top of my reeds for Monday night, and it paid off, because Monday would always seem to come fast. Like boom, we're going to play. We have to be at this club, that club. Right. And the parts I had to play were hard sometimes.
Yeah, I remember that.
The flute parts were, Dave loved the flute with the trumpet and all kinds of things. So I used to keep my chops up, and there was something on piccolo too, a Chick Corea tune. What was it?
Spain, right?
Spain, yeah.
That's
the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I have you here to sing the songs,
Yeah, but I remember going. I think that club on 86th Street where the band Stryker was it?
Strikers.
Was it Strikers?
Strikers was one.
Yeah, I met, and was it
Eric's was the other one.
That was on the east side.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that sort of thing was almost easy to know. Okay, I know what I have to play, so I would focus on those things, but then. That brings up a reason that I left. I played with American Symphony for 2 years. when I came out of the military in 1970, unfortunately, I did that for 3 years. But when I came back to New York, there was a lot of work going on, actually, gratefully, but I was getting a lot of calls for classical work. So I played second clarinet in the American Symphony for about 2 years, and Leo Stokowski was still there. So that was a wonderful experience.
Sure.
And sometimes when they had the Metropolis conducting competitions, they would have the guys that played first, they would disappear. Hey, Dave, can you play first tomorrow? I'm not going to be here. Oh, yeah, now I get to play first when these conductors come up and just say, okay, put up, you don't know which piece they're going to call. And I ran right into Scheherazade one morning.
Oh, my
One
goodness.
guy it was on the stand, but we had no chance to take the music. And
Right.
I mean, these guys that were there, usually, even Joe Rabai was there at one period of time. They know these pieces. They've played them a million times, Right. So again, the sight reading came in handy. But, if I knew something was like Scheherazade was going to be there, you can bet I practiced it. But I got to the point, and then if I subbed on Thad Jones' band Monday nights, if it was that period of time, before Dave Matthews, I said, "Oh, this is getting crazy. Be up till 3 a.m, then show up at 9:30, 10 o'clock for a rehearsal." And one morning, I came in like 9:45. I was playing second clarinet, and I think there was some bass clarinet. So I was warming up. You have that cacophony in the room.
Yeah.
And you could see Stokowski, they used to call him Stokey.
Right.
He was way up in the nosebleed seats and looking down at the musicians. And Arthur Aaron, the contractor, he's the percussionist, just in case you didn't know.
Gregory's coffee always comes in handy.
Arthur Aaron came up to me, a little guy about 5'1", and he whispered in my ear, among all this cacophony, he said, "Mr. Tofani," he said, "Maestro would like you to be in your seat at 9:30 and practice your parts. He likes to look down and see he likes to look down and see all his players practicing the excerpts from the concert." Oh, I said, okay. So from then on, I was trying to get there at 9:30. So I that's where the classical and the jazz lifestyle kind of collided.
Right.
I was saying, and I was worn out, I was getting tired. And I said to myself, oh boy, I think I'm going to have to let this go. So I was starting to do some dates. So the American Symphony, of course, once you commit to a rehearsal and a concert, you can't, I'm sending a sub, they don't want to know.
No, they don't. That's a different world.
So I gradually left.
Right.
So
and you were quite busy, and I'll just. You may not remember this. You probably, and there's no reason you should. But at one point in the 70s, when I was still in school, and I had heard about you from Joe Allard, and I had heard you play with Dave Matthews' band. And I said, I got to get some lessons from this guy. I need to get some feedback and, better understanding of, playing lead and playing soprano, saxophone, and alto. And we set up a lesson. You were living on the west side. It was like a garden.
75th Street.
Yes, there was like
okay. Garden apartment.
And we set up an appointment. And the night before you called, "Ed, I got to cancel. I got called for a date tomorrow." Okay, we set up another date. This went on, scheduling, canceling for literally about six lessons. We canceled like this. Finally, we got a lesson in, and I said, "Wow!" And then I realized this guy must be so busy and it was true. You really were that busy that, you never knew. Sometimes the night before sessions, you'd get called from Radio Registry.
Certain,